So Guatemalans will have, because of their notion of time, this ability to go back to that place and time where those two experiences collided, right? And so it's particularly important to be sensitive when people seem traumatized about something that you yourself might not assess as a particularly traumatic interaction, right? And it's more around the feeling of that interaction for someone and what that brought them back to, right? And I think this is something that we don't often think about in terms of trauma, but trauma is cumulative, right? It's not like it happens and then it stops, right? Often from Guatemalans who have fled Guatemala, there's been trauma upon trauma upon trauma, right? And so if you have experiences that compound that in any way here in the United States, right? That's building on a whole legacy of prior trauma. So it may not be what happened here, right? But it may be what it's calling out to.
Hello and welcome back to the Partnership Connections podcast. This podcast is centered around child welfare training and educational topics, all with the goal of helping to support those already working in or with an interest in working in child welfare. My name is Stan Brazier, and I am the project director for the Learning Partnership between the Rhode Island Department of Children, Youth, and Families, or DCOF, and Rhode Island College. And joining me again as a co-host today is Holly Pacheco from DCOF. Holly, good to see you again, as
Mm.
always.
Great to be back, Stan.
All right, excited about today's topic?
Always excited about our topic.
Always. Siempre, right? Just a quick disclaimer before we get started. All the views and opinions expressed by both the hosts and guests are their own, do not necessarily reflect those of DCYF or the college. So without further ado, we'll talk a little bit about why we're here today and who's joining us to talk a little bit about this topic. So we're focusing our episode today on learning more about the Guatemalan immigrant community here in Rhode Island. We're going to cover a wide range of topics from current country conditions leading to migration, family structures and values, challenges and strengths of this community, and ultimately how we can all play a better part in building trust and support. So our guest today is Dr. Gabriela Torres, professor in the Department of Anthropology at Rhode Island College. As a scholar, she has published over 35 peer-reviewed articles, research reports, and book chapters, in addition to volumes on marital rape and sexual violence and intimacy. Most recently, Dr. Torres has published regularly on anti-racist and intercultural teaching and learning, BIPOC mentoring in higher education, and on equity policies. She is currently co-editor-in-chief of Feminist Anthropology. Dr. Torres has been sought as an expert witness since 2011 in both U.S. and Canadian courts, where she has provided country conditions expertise on gender-based, gang, and anti-Indigenous violence in Guatemala. Her expert testimony has been used in asylum courts, U.S. District Court, Canadian Federal Court, and New York Criminal Court, and criminal and juvenile courts in New York and Massachusetts. It's a great honor, Dr. Torres. Thank you so much for being here and welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure. It's
Welcome.
a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So let's just start off. We like to try to start off similarly with a lot of the guests we have. Just tell us like a little bit about yourself and your personal journey that led to your career path and maybe your interest in some of the work that you've done.
Sure. So, I'm Guatemalan by birth, actually by family. So all my family is Guatemalan. And I migrated as a refugee to Canada, when I was 12. And so I've always continued to have an interest in Guatemalan topics. And I actually started my career in economics, because I thought that's what would get me a job. And then very quickly realized that what I was trying to understand in economics was culture, and economics was a bad fit for that. And so I came to anthropology, and then continuing to take higher education in anthropology from my deep interest in understanding culture and the mixing of cultures. So that's kind of how I came to it. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, great. Thank you for that. It kind of think leads nicely into our next question. So, maybe from your own personal experience or now that you've been in this work for a while, can you kind of help us understand how family structures and some cultural values, as well as different concepts that people might be familiar with, maybe they're not familiar with, but things like machismo or Marianismo may influence like gender roles in Guatemala and shape people's everyday lives, and maybe kind of give us a little bit of an insight into what people's everyday lives might look like, both now and maybe from your own personal experience.
Yeah. So I think, the migration process creates kind of two moments at which the family composition is really in many ways in question, right? And so one are what does the family look like in place in Guatemala? And that never stays static, right? But often what people do is they have these ideals of what family used to be in Guatemala. Right. So you'll see that people want to attach themselves to ideas of the man as the breadwinner, which is an ideal in the Guatemalan expectation of gender. It's not actually a reality, but it's an ideal, right? But when people migrate, they want to keep that attachment to home. And so that ideal becomes reinforced in this place. At the same time that you often have a challenge of those ideals, particularly by kids in families, right? Where they're like, well, I've grown up here, and my US values are these that are different from my family values. So often what you have is you have the values in the place of origin, which differ in some ways from the values of the migrant family, which then differ from the struggles that are taking place as families are adapting to a new environment.
So, I'm wondering, why do you feel as if you said it's sort of an ideal, right? That the man is sort of the breadwinner, right? Why do you think that there's this desire to maintain that ideal, and why is it an ideal that's maybe not always realized?
Yeah. So even in Guatemala, it isn't realized. So when we look at in Guatemala itself, when we look at how people are able to create sustenance for their families, right? It is often men and women both who work. They work in typically in different kinds of things, but it's both who work. And there's a lot of female-headed households in the Guatemalan context. Um, and so even in Guatemala, it's is not the reality for most. But culturally, and this is both for indigenous and non-indigenous Guatemalans, and Guatemalans are one of the countries in Latin America in which it's a very large indigenous population. So depending on who you ask, it's anywhere from 45 to 55% of the population in Guatemala is indigenous. And the other part of the population is non-indigenous or indigenous from Black roots. So the other part of the population is what we call Ladino in Guatemala, not Latino, but Ladino with a D. And Ladinos in Guatemala are people who look like myself, white passing individuals. Um, and then there is Garifuna people who are seen as indigenous people from African roots. And those African roots come from um, slave ships that were marooned in the Caribbean. And so there were communities which developed separately in Guatemala that are seen as indigenous, even though they have Black roots. And so Guatemala has this really complicated ethnic variation that other Latin American countries don't have. So even within indigenous groups, Guatemala has at least 24 indigenous Mayan groups, plus the Garifuna peoples, plus the Ladinos. So it's a very diverse. So in all of those different ethnic differences and what sometimes people call racial differences, there is this belief on the primacy of the male as the breadwinner, as the head of the family. Sometimes that's reinforced through religion. And that's both Catholicism and evangelical Christianity, which are pretty common in Guatemala and pretty much equally the same. Guatemalans have a very high rate of evangelical Christianity, and a very high rate of Catholicism. And so in those faiths, there's often a reinforcement of the primacy of the man in those households.
So thank you for that. So knowing that that's not always the reality, does that lead to a lot of male questioning of self-worth, mental health
Yes.
issues, depression, etc.? And does that carry over with when they
Yeah.
migrate as well?
Absolutely. So I think when people migrate to retain their identity and their attachment to home, often what you see almost a reinforced ideal cultural structure, right? So people want to retain the ideal of Guatemala, right? Rather than the reality of Guatemala, right? So when you ask people about their parents, like, how did your parents make a living? They will tell you that their mom worked just as much as their dad, right? Like their mom might have had like a stationery store, that's where she sold, little notebooks, school notebooks, and things to people around the community. And their dad might have had this other job, right? But they'll tell you both worked, but then in their families here, they might want their partner not to work. Although that's also changing, right? Because of economic situations, right? But the way that it would present itself is like, so the woman can work, but she needs to come right back. And she still needs to be in charge of all the things women should be doing, like taking care of the house, making sure the food is done. Um, Although there is variation in that, taking care of the kids. So those gendered responsibilities still exists. And the attachment to those is an attachment to a Guatemalanness, if you will.
And when I would imagine that it would lead to some friction and some frustration within family structures as well. Um, but what about issues like sort of larger systemic issues that are currently happening in Guatemala and how we might see some of those things translate into their migration as well, influencing how they assimilate or maybe have trouble assimilating here, right? Issues like corruption, weak institutions, gang involvement. How might these things influence people's decisions to migrate? And can you kind of explain how violence, especially gender-based violence, fits
Sure.
into sort of the broader migration story?
So, I think the most important part to think about here is that Guatemalans are in the United States not because they absolutely love the United States, which they do, but actually because they can't be in Guatemala. Because Guatemala is an incredibly unsafe place, and it's also a place where genocide has taken place in the very recent past. And when genocide takes place in a society, that creates a significant breakdown in a society that persists through generations, right? And so that is a really important context to think about Guatemalans, right? We can't think about Guatemalans um, as persons who choose to be here. Most people flee Guatemalan spaces and arrive in Providence or wherever it is in the United States. What they're fleeing from is they're fleeing from that society that's a post-conflict society, right? That's a post-genocide society. And that's a society where you really have a breakdown of governance, right? Where the levels of corruption are incredibly high. Guatemala has been ranked amongst the most corrupt states in the Americas and even the world. Um, and this has become so pervasive that young people, so there's some really interesting scholarship in that young people feel that their only chance at success is to be able to get a piece of that corruption, right? So it's seen as a space where you could be gain a sustainable living versus other spaces where you don't. And so there's different kinds of corruptions. And so one is corruption within what we would say formal state structures, right? Like government or police or courts, right? And that corruption is rampant. Um, in fact, the United Nations used to have a corruption monitoring unit in Guatemala, which was kicked out by the government when that corruption investigation unit started investigating the government's families, which were highly corrupt at the time, and probably there's still high levels of corruption. And um, and so we don't even have a unit that assesses the levels of corruption. But the last time those were assessed, they were incredibly high. So that's one part of corruption. The other part of corruption is what has come in as a quasi authority across all of Guatemala is gangs. So Guatemala rests in the isthmus of Central America, which is really a trafficking zone. So it's an area where things get trafficked, both people and drugs, right? And so in Guatemala, you have a really high level of functioning gangs and and gangs make their money out of exploiting local populations, right? And so they either exploit them as human labor or they exploit them as resources, so through extortion. And when we think about territorial control, there are significant number of areas in Guatemala that are not under state territorial control, but under gang control. So they are quasi authorities. So this is the space that people are fleeing from. So when they get to the United States, what does this look like? It looks like fear of authority, right? Authority in the Guatemalan context is always going to get you in trouble, right? In some kind of trouble, either because someone's going to try to extort you from the government itself or from or the government is going to tell the gang, or the gang is going to tell the government. And so it's like for them, any authority is any interaction with authority is a potential problem. So people are incredibly distrustful of authority and they're incredibly distrustful of governance. This has only gotten worse in the United States as a result of ICE operations. And I think that has created a lot of distrust in authority where people might have begun to feel trust, right? And Providence is a place where that trust might still be there to some extent because of the choices that the city has made. But um, I think that has created a lot of the fear, right, that existed in Guatemala. Guatemala was rampant with paramilitaries, and ICE to Guatemalans looks a lot like a paramilitary group. And so for them, authority is something that they have a hard time with. And so I don't know if your listeners have interacted a lot with Guatemalans, but anthropologists who have studied Guatemalan dispositions post-conflict, what they find is that Guatemalans tend to be fairly cautious in their interpersonal relations, right? And so they tend to be fairly reserved and really wait to understand where a person is coming from, in many ways, much longer than people who come from non-conflict backgrounds, right? Because for them, understanding whether or not they can trust someone is about whether or not their life is safe or not. That's the context people come from.
Gotcha. Yeah, you mentioned this. The only way I'm going to get ahead is if I join in the corruption piece. And I'm kind of wondering, like, one, how might that sort of divide families, and also what factors kind of lead to that decision making process, and like does that decision making process kind of get suppressed, and would it carry over to them after their post migration, and then saying, like, you mentioned that it can be very reserved, right? But I'm wondering, like, are there things that would influence their decision to say, well, I've been dealing with this corruption and I don't want to be subject to the corruption anymore. And the only way that I'm going to get ahead is I'm going to sort of join it, like you said, join in this corruption in some way, shape, or form. So I was just
Yeah.
wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think so if we look at the books that have been written about Guatemalans in the United States. So there's a couple of pieces that I might recommend. One is In Search of Providence by Patricia Foxen, and the other one is a book that's written about New Bedford by Lisa Maya Nauer. And both of those pieces of scholarship, what they show is that actually most Guatemalans who migrate want to get ahead by escaping those practices of corruption, right? And and they're fairly insular, so there's a lot of family businesses, right, as a way to retain safety. So what you have is you have a lot of Guatemalans from similar communities migrating to get from the same community, migrating to the same place. And so you'll often find, this is certainly the case in Providence, but also in New Bedford, is you'll often find multiple people from the same town, right? And so the safety is in the insularity of the community, right? And that's pretty typical of migrant communities, actually, that there is a lot of self-help within the community. But most Guatemalans who come here have escaped that corruption mindset. They don't want to participate in it. That's why they ran here, right? Because they don't see that as a good end for themselves. Because as soon as you get involved in the corruption, then your life is actually in danger, right? Because it's a zero-sum game in terms of who gets a piece of the pie.
Right, that's helpful because it's sort of wondering if it's just sort of this, like, if you can't beat them, join them mentality that might uh, eventually find its way through the cracks. But that's helpful to know.
I did want to just comment about you saying that a lot of times they're, really careful in their interpersonal relationships. And I thank you for sharing that because for workers that are listening to this, um, just so that that's something that they can be mindful because being a government agency, we're often seen as authority and we're often used to not being trusted. It takes a little bit to get to that point, but it sounds like it's going to take a little bit longer, even so, with this community. So thank you for sharing that. My next question here is you started to talk about migrating. So do families usually migrate together? You know, is it broken up? Does one individual come first? I'm not sure if it matters on the situation or if there's something that's usually more common. And why would that be?
Social supports is the answer. So people migrate in social support groups. And so that might be an actual biologically related family, or it might be social support unit. So people, and it's serial migration, right? So it is one family member comes, they continue to support their family in Guatemala. That's also really important. A lot of Guatemalans who are here are supporting Guatemalans in Guatemala. Right. That's actually one of the things we don't often talk about is how much Guatemalans that are here in the United States are ensuring that other Guatemalans stay in Guatemala, right? Because they're sending money back from their jobs. So often when we think about why people work so hard, right? It's not because they're just meeting their own subsistence needs, but because they're meeting the needs of their families. So often what happens is that one person migrates, and then when the situation in Guatemala continues and continues to get worse, which is what's happened over the last few decades, then people start migrating here. So you have Guatemalans here that have been here 30 years, and you have Guatemalans who are much more recent migrants. I think the other thing that is beginning to really affect Guatemala is climate migration. And we don't often think about climate migration. So, we do know about places like Puerto Rico that has had hurricanes and that has had uh, earthquakes, but Guatemala has also had two very large climactic events and a volcanic eruption, which created some significant consequences in terms of people from certain areas needing to migrate.
Yeah, I think unfortunately we're going to be seeing more and more of that, not just in Guatemala, but in a lot of other places too, a lot of climate refugees, right? So, um, is it true that, and how prevalent might it be amongst the Guatemalan community or Guatemalan migrants of sort of gang dynamics, quote unquote, following them to the US? And what does research actually show about that?
Well, I'm not sure that we have a lot of research about that. Um, Usually people who migrate here, what we do know is people who migrate here are migrating um, to get away from gangs, right? They're migrating because gangs have sought them out as persons to be trafficked, right? And that's tends to be gendered for women and LGBT folks. Or it has targeted them as potential soldiers. So, and that tends to be young men. So often families migrate here to get away from gangs. And so people here still worry about the targeting of their families in Guatemala. And um, and that's pretty common. So once it is known that you have family that supports you from outside of Guatemala, then your Guatemalan family becomes a target for extortion, right? Because, you know, they know you have access to funds that could be extorted. And so that's often why you get the follow-up migration, right? Because let's say what you're doing is you're supporting your mother to take care of your kids in Guatemala, But then the gang is like, give me your money, or I'm going to take these boys into the gang. And so then you have the kids migrate over, and we see that a lot. There's not a lot of research about Guatemalans involved in gangs. Um, in the East Coast, I would say there is some in the California area, but even that research is pretty old at this point. But there isn't anything to suggest that Guatemalans here come to be involved in gangs.
Yeah, no, I think it was more so thinking about how that those dynamics or some of that pressure or some of the problems continue to kind of follow
Yeah.
them, right?
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
they definitely
Uh,
continue to follow them, right? And so, and so what are the cultural reactions to that, right? Again, it's insularity, right? Keeping a closed community. Right. And so you often find that when Guatemalans meet other Guatemalans, it's actually really challenging because the first thing that Guatemalans do when they meet each other is try to locate yourself in a political and geographic space to see how much of a risk you might be to the other Guatemalan. Right. And so this insularity, right? Where does one person come from, right? So between Guatemalans, what you'll have people ask, and this is good to know for practitioners is that this is a really good question that people are very familiar with is to ask people where they're from in Guatemala, like what town they're from and what town their parents were from. And so we might think that they're Guatemalans, but most Guatemalans don't think of themselves as Guatemalan. They think of themselves as a person who comes from this town. So, for example, my father came from the Petén and from a specific place called Flores. And so, and I can tell you exactly where my grandparents used to live. So, they used to live in San Luis Cotamalguapa, and so like I can have those conversations. So Guatemalans often like to talk about where their family is from.
can you kind of paint the picture of what the population looks like here in Rhode Island and maybe even more specifically in Providence, and what are some of the biggest challenges that Guatemalan immigrants face here locally?
The Guatemalans in Providence are primarily of indigenous backgrounds. And so you have a lot of it's we assume that Guatemalans speak Spanish, but a lot of indigenous Guatemalans do not speak Spanish. They actually speak their indigenous language. And many people learn Spanish here, right? And so that's something that's different and very specific to, I would say, communities in Providence or New Bedford, right? Where you have a very high concentration of group migration from indigenous backgrounds. So that's one characteristic. I think in terms of challenges, people have challenges in terms of housing. Providence is a pretty expensive space, and so the challenge of housing is common, and Guatemalans also face it. The challenges of employment. Particularly when you have members of your family who are undocumented, right? Then, who is capable of being employed? How do you organize that as a family group as to who's able to make a living and who isn't? Um, and how do you make sure that people are safe within your family, right? So that's an increasing challenge for people that has really shaped how individuals are choosing to engage, right? And to engage with how they make a living, and to engage with even things like education, right? So we see this even at Rick, right? Where you have students who are worried about the status of themselves or their families. Um, and and then, may not have as much mobility around the state as they would have otherwise, because they want to stay safe, or they want to keep their family members safe. You'll certainly have a doubling down on the secrecy and insularity. And so trying to convey the least information possible is also a pretty clear characteristic, right? Um, that pre-existed in a post-conflict society, but which now is really challenging relations. I would say one of the really great things that Guatemalans have in Providence specifically is other Guatemalans. And so Guatemala has a really high concentrations of business owners here in Providence, right? As you drive around, you'll see so many Guatemalan tortillerias, and you see a bunch of Guatemalan restaurants that, to the person who is unable to read the signs, might look like Mexican restaurants, but they're actually Guatemalan. You have restaurants that are very blatantly Guatemalan, like the one that's called Mi Guatemalan, or you have um, other ones that are called La Estancia. They're all Guatemalans. They come from different areas of Guatemala. And so Guatemalans concentrate in these spaces, right? And so if any of your listeners ever want to see what a Guatemalan Sunday morning looks like, Meet Guatemala is a great space to see families and to try the food that Guatemalans typically have for breakfast. Guatemalans have a very, very substantial, delicious breakfast of, like, you know, eggs and black beans and tortillas and maybe a piece of meat, all for breakfast, with, like, not a cup of coffee, but a jar of coffee right there. And so, like, if you work with Guatemalans, it's really great. You have a great chance in Providence to get a sense as to how Guatemalans socialize with each other. And then on Sunday mornings, you'll see families after having gone to church. Everyone in the family is there. I mean, Mi Guatemala, if you drive by it on a Sunday, is like full of Guatemala. It's not only Mi Guatemala, it's also all the other Guatemalan restaurants are the same, right? So that's a really unifying space for Guatemalans to be able to get their food that they're accustomed to. So that's not a challenge, but a real strength that they have here in Providence and in Rhode Island.
Yeah, that sounds like my kind of breakfast, to be honest with you. I love a big breakfast. Just a quick follow-up in terms of, you said a lot of indigenous folks might even be having to learn Spanish when they get here. What is their literacy levels typically like? And could that sort of compound challenges?
Absolutely, that compounds. So generally in Guatemala, illiteracy is much higher than in the United States, like much, much higher. And in indigenous communities, it's the highest. Um, and so I would say that particularly the older folks will have lower literacy rates than younger folks in Guatemala. Um, but access to education for women, for indigenous Guatemalan women, tends to be much lower. And so that's also a group that's pretty marginalized from education, and you'd probably see that here. Um, Often people are pulled out of education at very early grades. So a lot of people my age, and I'm in my 50s, will have been pulled out of school like in grade school. And so while there might be literacy there is a limitation in terms of how comfortable people might feel.
What does a truly trauma-informed approach look like when working with Guatemalan immigrant families?
So that's a great question. So I would say I think all Guatemalans, but Guatemalans who come from indigenous backgrounds, one of the key things is that their conception of time is not linear. Their conception of time is cyclical. So the Mayan calendar is a cycle, right, of time that comes and comes again. So often when I work with, I work with attorneys all the time, and they will say when I'm talking to my client, I can't get a good timeline. They'll say, they'll like I think they're lying to me, right? I think they're not telling the truth, or maybe they have too much trauma or a mental health issue. Like, why is it that they're not giving me a straight timeline of how things happened, right? And so we are very linear in this culture, right? Even in my family, I'm married to a non-Guatemalan. And I'll say, oh, yeah, like the other day when this happened. And for me, I've noticed, like many Guatemalans, is I organize my events on categories, not time. And so one of the trauma-informed hints that I could give to people is the linear timeline is less likely to exist for Guatemalans, and them being unable to present that to you doesn't mean that they're hiding or lying. It means that their timeline is cyclical. So try to read through that. So a trauma and a culturally informed approach would first think about the different conceptions of time. The other thing is, I think be really clear that people come from a space where authorities were not to be trusted. Authorities were a threat. So being fully transparent, um, I think as much as possible, having introductions to Guatemalans from other Guatemalans that are trusted is really, really important. Um, so being transparent about what are the goals of a meeting, right? What are you trying to do in a meeting? So the worst approach for Guatemalan would be to just start asking questions, because that's a red flag right there, right? The better approach, the more trauma-informed approach would be to actually tell someone the purpose of this meeting. What am I trying to get out of this meeting? Um, what is your role in this meeting? What are your rights in this meeting? And I don't know what your protocols are, right? But that those are really important trauma-informed things for Guatemala, because all of those will get you trust, right? Because the first thing Guatemalans are going to try to do is understand your position. What are you trying to get from me? And even if you tell someone, they may not believe you, but they at least have some guideposts to see if you're sounding true to what you said you were going to do, right? So that's a pretty important thing for trauma informed. I think, one of the challenges we run into when we work in social work kinds of settings, right, where we rely on narratives, right? So to understand people's narratives is that often people retelling their narrative of something that might have happened in the United States is triggering not necessarily of that narrative, but how that narrative reminded them of something that had taken place in their home country. So, for example, I was talking to a student about an interaction that they had had with a professor that made them feel belittled. And what had taken place with the professor was not that egregious, right? But they were distraught, and it was because that experience and because of the cyclicality of Guatemalan time, that experience put them right back in that space. So Guatemalans will have, because of their notion of time, this ability to go back to that place and time where those two experiences collided, right? And so it's particularly important to be sensitive when people seem traumatized about something that you yourself might not assess as a particularly traumatic interaction, right? And it's more around the feeling of that interaction for someone and what that brought them back to, right? And I think this is something that we don't often think about in terms of trauma, but trauma is cumulative, right? It's not like it happens and then it stops, right? Often from Guatemalans who have fled Guatemala, there's been trauma upon trauma, right? And so if you have experiences that compound that in any way here in the United States, right? That's building on a whole legacy of prior trauma. So it may not be what happened here, right? But it may be what it's calling out to.
Yeah, I think the piece around the understanding of the how they sort of interpret time, the nonlinear structure, I would imagine that could be really helpful for within child welfare to know, right? Because we're trying to improve or help them make some sort of a behavior change so that they'll be able to better care for their children, right? And there's got to be something that gets resolved or improved, but it's kind of starts because of there was an incident, right? So I've just if they're continuing to go back to that incident, we don't want to dwell on that necessarily too much. It's important to be able to like think about how that can be prevented in the future, but I think that understanding isn't I would imagine this would be pretty helpful for hopefully some of
Yeah,
our
and
audience or some people that listen to this and that are working, especially in child welfare, and because there's all these other complexities like we've talked about, like the distrust of authority, and then how it might take a little bit longer to build some of that trust, etc. Language barriers, other cultural considerations, but like that time piece, I think something
yeah,
that I wasn't aware of, so I think would be that's helpful, I think, for people to know about.
yeah. And I think it could also be helpful because of the cyclicality is to use narrative to find times when things might have worked really well for children and go back to that feeling to support people. How did we get back to that feeling? What were the conditions that got us to that feeling in the past, and how do we get back? Because there's there's always the assumption that we'll get back to something that has happened before.
Right, and not necessarily that you have to make this whole big change, but to just kind of help give somebody that insight into, listen, you did this before, you can do it again. You just need to be able to get that insight back.
Yeah.
Um, what's one thing, if you had to pick one thing that you wish more people here in Rhode Island, here locally, helping professionals or otherwise, just the general population, what's one thing that you wish people understood? More about the Guatemalan community or better.
Mhm. I think the fact that Guatemalans are really proud of being Guatemalan, um, and that they're really proud of their heritage. Um, I think that's really important. Something that people don't know, and that represents itself in multiple ways. So that represents itself in food, right? And so if a Guatemalan ever gives you food, even if you don't intend to eat it, you should accept it because that is probably the biggest demonstration of trust that someone might have with you. Is if you accept their food, then that means they have a relationship with you because you've accepted them. So their food as a relationship. So I think that's that pride. And for Guatemalans, a lot of times it's with food, as in many immigrant communities. So there's a lot of pride in Guatemala, and I think that's important to know, and that's important to know in the context of the settlement experience into the United States, right? Because Guatemalans will probably want to be Guatemalan American and not just American, right? Because they're so proud of their heritage. Just like many Italians are Italian Americans and, or Irish Americans because they're really proud of their heritage.
Yeah, you can find a identity and belonging, hopefully in both,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah. What's your favorite Guatemalan dish?
Oh, that's so hard. So but I think if I had to choose something, it's something that's called a chuchito. And the translation of chuchito means small dog, which is not what it is. A chuchito is like a mini tamal that's made with butter instead of lard. So tamales are usually made with lard, but the chuchito is made with butter, and it typically has like a piece of pork or chicken and a really delicious sauce, and the butter dough is also full of like red sauce. So it's kind of a reddish butter dough, and it is fantastic. It comes in a corn husk. Tamales typically come in a plantain, like a plantain leaf. But chuchitos come in these corn husks, which give it this really, really cool texture. And so they're super tasty. I love them. They can be bought at all sorts of places. La Castellana on Smith Street will have really tasty chuchitos, and but I also love myself a really good tortilla with butter and salt. Oh my God, that's the best. Like a freshly made tortillas. And most places will not tell you they make tortillas, but if you ask them for tortillas, you can buy them by the dollar. So you could get $1 of tortillas, and then you take it home when it's nice and hot, and you put butter and salt on it. Oh my God, there's nothing better.
That's yeah, sounds simple but delicious, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds
Are you a
great.
corn or flour tortilla
They're
person?
corn.
They're
Guatemala's,
corn. Okay.
unless you're from certain parts of Guatemala where they make these flour tortillas. So there's also
Okay.
flour tortillas, but most Guatemalans here in Rhode Island is corn tortillas.
Gotcha. All right. Thank you. Holly, do you have any final questions?
No, thank you. I learned a lot today.
Oh,
A lot of
thank
great
Yeah.
you.
information. Yeah.
Thank you
Yeah,
so
thank
much.
you.
Thanks for your
It's been
time.
a pleasure. Thanks for wanting to learn about Guatemalans. I love it.
Of course. Thank you.